following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. As you know, this podcast is part of a much larger network called Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Comfortably Zoned was established by Ralph Tyko in February of 2016. Initially, the network focused on sports and nostalgia, but has morphed into a much more diverse platform dealing with specific themes or interests that modern-day commercial radio just can't or doesn't offer. Zig, as he is known by friends, is the ideal producer for Comfortably Zoned. He's a Renaissance man who has redefined himself several times throughout his professional career. Among his various incarnations, Zig wrote, performed, and produced comedy. He was a stay-at-home father, insurance salesman, the West Coast representative for the Topps Baseball Card Company, and a cable sports show host. Many listeners have asked me to tell them more about Zig, the man who signs off each and every Comfortably Zoned podcast with the salutation, "May your dreams be wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren away from military recruiters and off the laps of clergy who like to wear dresses." Since no one would believe a guy like Zig actually exists, I've asked him to be my guest on this podcast and to talk about his career and the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Welcome to the podcast, Zig. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much. It's my privilege. You're an incredible asset to Comfortably Zoned, and you're one of the most enjoyable people to work with and play with that I've ever known. So thanks for being my friend. Thanks for being my cohort in all of this, or at least one of my cohorts.
Thank you. Zig, you're a native New Yorker, and I won't hold that against you. But you're also a rabid Mets fan, which is a tougher pill for me to swallow, but I won't hold that against you either. I'd like to know, however, being a Brooklyn Dodgers enthusiast myself, what was it like growing up in Queens in the 1950s after the Brooklyn Dodgers skipped town for L.A.?
Well, for me, it was after the New York Giants skipped town. I was an avid New York Giant fan, and they moved to San Francisco. It was crushing for a 10-year-old. I really suffered a lot from losing the team I grew up rooting for. And the irony is that I was in the Air Force in the 60s and stayed in California. I was stationed out near San Francisco, so I got to see the Giants play in the later stages of Willie's career, and things work out the way they work out, and no rhyme or reason sometimes, but I've made baseball my passion, communicating my passion. I did comedy for a long time, and to do that, you have to have some sort of a social awareness to see what's out there, what people laugh at, what people cry at, and oftentimes they're the same things. Just it depends on how you present it, but podcasting came naturally to me, and when I expanded the network, I wanted folks like you yourself who can write and communicate as well. It's I have a number of those folks: Peter Golenbach, David Nemec, Hal Bach. I'm not going to leave anybody out, but Mark Littell, a bunch of folks on the network who have that rare combination of being able to put their words down and at the same time think on their feet and know what questions to ask and have an interesting voice and a passion for what they do and something to connect with the audience that I call it an intangible. And I look for those folks who qualify along those lines. And you're one, and like I say, I'm honored that you chose me as a guest.
You know, Zig, you mentioned something, and I do want to get to the lineup that you have because they're a very impressive range of folks there. But, you know, you said you were out in the San Francisco area in the Air Force, and you got to see Willie Mays play the end of his career, near the end of his career. It's amazing that you were able to switch the allegiance from the New York to the San Francisco Giants because my understanding...
the Giants, I was an apologist for the Giants, not a fan. I remained a fan of the Mets for the same reason, for the reasons that I gave before. It's terrible when a team leaves a fan, but I think it's worse when a fan leaves a team. Hard to explain, but loyalty goes a long way with me, and I remain loyal to the Mets. And I remember distinctly because I really followed them after they moved to San Francisco before the Mets were born, and I remember thinking about that. I'm going to be one or the other, and it took me a while to come to the idea. Well, this is a new team. It's, you know, you're going to see it right from the start. You're going to see how it's formed. And by then I was like 16, and I was well aware of what was going on in baseball. I still had the Yankees to go to in New York, but I never did establish a rooting interest in them until later on in life, and that's another story for another podcast. But so I consider myself bi-coastal in a number of ways, if not attitude. I have a New York attitude, and I live in California, and it's totally different, both as a fan and as a sports fan, and the way I look at life. And so consequently, most, if not all of my friends are originally Easterners, and what with the internet and this network, it's easy for me to communicate with a bunch of folks from the East Coast primarily, and I do that because out here I feel at times like a fish out of water. So
the Mets thing is really interesting to me in light of the comments you said about the loyalty of the fans, because New York fans are really die-hard loyalists. You just don't have many people that go Yankees, Mets, Jets, and Giants. It's one or the other. And the Mets, as we know, were a hybrid. I mean, they got that royal blue and white for the Brooklyn Dodgers and the orange and the black for the New York Giants. And seeing as to how the Giants and the Dodgers hate each other, how could either of those fan bases join together to support the Mets?
Well, remember, too, that the Mets have the Yankee pinstripes as well. So they tried to draw from all three fan bases, and it wasn't easy. As an original Met fan, to see folks like washed-up folks like Gil Hodges and Duke Snider come through just for their namesake, and Charlie Neal, who was over the hill really fast, and a bunch of others. Joe Ginsberg had Dodger roots to him. It was tough as a kid, especially the Mets were so horribly bad in their first couple of years that I can't tell you how the cuteness of all that wore off quickly for the diehard baseball fans. A lot of books been written, a lot of fun stuff been said, but seeing Roger Craig, for instance, lose 20 games in a row, 2 years in a row, he lost 20 games for a horrible team. It wasn't fun after a while. But the memories are good. They're excellent. When they won in '69, it was absolutely special. I was out in California, and I got to see it on television. It was the year the Jets won, the year the Knicks did well. It all came together. But my boyhood teams left a lot to be desired. The Knicks sucked when I was growing up. The Rangers were terrible, but you remain loyal, and that's my credence.
Now, I've got to mention this because you talked about how the left coast resembles more of your lifestyle, or as you are now. And when I was going through your Facebook, I found some wonderful photographs. The one that really caught my attention, so much so that I copied it and I have it in my photo album on my phone, is a young Ralph Tyko in an Air Force uniform with a leather jacket, very, handsome guy, looked like he was ripped, everything. And you know me, I'm a Quaker pacifist. So I'm more in line with...
I was about to be drafted. And I could not get a deferment because you had to matriculate to a university, a college, to do that. And there was very little chance of that because of my study habits, this, that, and the other thing. And I was 19. I had no idea what Vietnam was. I had no idea who the people were. I had no idea from nothing. But I got a letter, and I'm standing out in front of my mother's apartment, our apartment, and reading the letter and shaking. And a kid comes by named Kenny Kirsch. He was going to my building in the co-op that I lived in, Northridge, in Jackson Heights, New York. And he's going to see his dance partner in what was it? Dick Clark had a show, a dance show.
American Bandstand. It was out of Philly.
Out of Philly, and he would take Karen Sherman, a very, very pretty girl, who from my building, to the dance thing and dance. So he knew Karen Sherman. He's coming to my building. He had an Air Force uniform on. Wow. He was home on leave. He had enlisted in the Air Force because, as promised, this is what they promised. They said, you probably won't go to Vietnam, but if you go to Vietnam, you will be surrounded, your base will be surrounded by the Army to protect you. And they will be surrounded by the Marines to protect them. That's exactly what they said. Well, little did I know, I never got to go to Vietnam, but close friends, really close friends, had to go to Vietnam. There were two things that they didn't tell you about. One was the mortars coming in. Another one was the Viet Cong that you'd be stationed with, who you'd work with during the day, and at night, this, that, and the other thing would happen. But there was a third thing, too, called Agent Orange, and they probably weren't, the recruiters, and they probably weren't aware of it, but it was real, and that was the killer in Vietnam. And another of the real tragedies is they did not have veterans hospitals set up. They did not have care. They had Ronald Reagan closing down mental institutions and putting veterans on the street. They had all kinds of stuff going on as a result of that unjust war. But I joined the Air Force at Kenny Kirsch's suggestion. I'm stationed at Travis the whole time. I did certain things to assure that I wouldn't get sent overseas. I like to say I contributed to it, but I wasn't. I was fortunate enough not to be. The irony is of this already long story, so there's no making it short, was that poor Kenny Kirsch did go to Vietnam eventually and suffered from Agent Orange for the rest of his shortened life, the effects of Agent Orange for the rest of his shortened life. He didn't know about it. We didn't hear that until years after. The veterans didn't even accept. They weren't treating kids coming back for that. But they knew. The armed services knew what was going on. They just weren't letting out that information. Just like they repeatedly, and I was stationed at Travis, and I'd see Travis Air Force Base, I'd see planes coming in with bodies on a regular basis that didn't. The figures, I'd see hundreds of bodies being taken off 141s and being sent home, as it were, and they never coincided with the numbers the numbers of casualties listed in the Air Force Times. So it's a crazy world, and know this: the government is lying to you as I speak. Somebody in the government is lying to you about something else that has nothing to do with it. Expect to hear lies from the government. And this government, the current administration, is atypical of that. It goes far beyond what the normal you're being lied to from both sides takes it. This guy, Trump, is very dangerous. That's just
so essentially aside, your politics never changed. What the experience in the Air Force did for you is just reinforced some of the feelings you already had.
No, actually, I went in with no politics. The Air Force didn't affect my politics one way or the other. It was a Boy Scout troop with no adult leadership. That's what the Air Force was. And I was lucky enough to skate with a 9-month early out because they were cutting back the troops. And when they found out that I didn't have enough time to be shipped out, they just gave me an early out. I was very fortunate. Like I say, a lot of my friends weren't that fortunate. And but my hippie politics came later. And most of my hippie politics came when I had a kid and I started caring about the future of the planet, his future. It wasn't just me. It all revolved around me until I was fortunate enough to be a dad.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about Philip, but I want to move on to the next stage of your career after the service, and that was comedy. You did a comedy act called
First I sold insurance, and I had an insurance agency. I worked traditionally very, very hard for 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
And at about 7 years, I found myself borrowing from Peter to pay Paul because I was always racing the check. You know, you just live a lifestyle when you're on the upward thing that puts you in debt and would keep you in debt. And around about the time that it wasn't fun anymore, my dad passed away at age 62. And I realized he had lived his entire life working, and his retirement was the 20 minutes he was in the hospital, that kind of thing. So it wasn't going to be me. And I, with the little money that I was left to at least get out of debt, I realized that I'm not going to go on doing this. I'm going to work 20 hours a week max and live the exchange time for money, which can't be regained, and live a lifestyle that downgrade my lifestyle so I don't have to work as hard and do what I want to do. So it was between radio and comedy. I chose comedy at the time because podcast with no commercial obligations, and you could say what you want. That's wonderful. It's cathartic. But radio, traditional radio, you can't say what you want. You're produced. So with comedy, going into comedy, I could say what I want. I produced my own act. And I was never reined in by anyone like I would in traditional radio. So I was doing comedy, and I got the opportunity to work as the West Coast representative for Topps, signing minor league players to contracts obligating them to their big league baseball card.
How'd you land that gig? That was a fascinating job.
Oh my God! They paid me to ride around. They paid me per diem and mileage to ride around the Northwest League, the California League, and go from hick town to hick town. When I say that respectively, I love minor league baseball, and sign players and communicate with the coaches and managers who are my boyhood heroes.
Uh-huh.
So I got to interview them without really interviewing them, just to talk to them. There was nothing put down on microphones or whatever, and I realized I was getting tremendous responses from these people. They tell me a lot of stuff. People like to talk to me for one reason or another. I found that out early, and one day I had the opportunity to produce a cable television show with the theme being, this is in the 90s, the theme being 1950s golden age of era baseball.
Wow,
and I got some people to come into the studio. I got Leonard Cobbett, Hank Sauer. I got Charlie Fox, Charlie Silvera, and Joe DeMaestri to come in and sit in, and I have, at least an hour on of interviews with all of those guys, and that was one of the highlights of my life, meeting those guys. The first person I ever interviewed was Hall of Fame baseball writer Leonard Cobbett. Oh my God! Thinking back then, he was two-sport Hall of Famer. He was a basketball Hall of Fame writer as well. And I sat with Leonard Cobbett, and I made him feel comfortable about talking to me, and he made me feel comfortable about talking to him. And that's where it got started. So
I got to ask you, being a father of three, And, you know, I did not have the responsibility of a single parent. My wife and I divided our time as creatively as we could. I worked when our boys were small. I taught during the day, then she worked at night, so there was always a parent home. But you were a single parent.
Oh, we had that too. I was the stay-at-home dad, not a single dad, for his first 5 years. So she was working, and that expression always feels good to me. It rolls off the tongue. She was working, and Philip and I were basically playing. I gave him the same spoiled upbringing that I got from my grandparents. He ran the family, and that was it. I didn't even bother with two high-strung folks who were in his genetics. His mother was a genius. She was a degree in 2 masters, a PhD in accounting, this, that, and the other thing. God rest her soul. Diane Satin, I'll give her a little credit for this, a lot of credit for this. But like I say, I got to experience something that was good on a number of levels. I was treated as Mr. Mom, sarcastically. This was the early 90s. Even by my mother, who could never accept the fact that men weren't supposed to be doing this.
Wow,
so I got to see what it's like an awareness of the genders. I sat in the park with like 7 or 8 women all day with the kid, watching our kids on the swing. And some of them liked me, some of them didn't. I identified all of us as breeders. And some couldn't understand that expression, but that's what we were. We were breeders. And there was nothing wrong with that. And that's something that women traditionally do, but men very rarely get the opportunity to experience what it's like to raise a kid on any level. They work, they come home, they tuck the kid in. So I had those first 5 years. They were the closest we ever were over the period of a lifetime. Couldn't have been more close than that. And with that comes, or came for me, an awful lot of empty nest syndrome, where, nothing I knew then, and I know now that nothing will be more important than that kid's first 5 years and what it takes to raise a kid just to keep him from crossing the street, that type of thing.
Oh, so, I got to believe your relationship with Philip is rock solid. I mean, clearly, that was a big part of his upbringing, and it was so rare at that time for men to stay at home with their kids. Your relation, what is Philip doing these days?
Well, he's his day job is he works for Kohl's, which is a retail outlet. He's in some sort of management training there. And he's a photographer. He goes to whatever it is, Comcast, or what do they call it?
Yeah, Comcast, Sports Network.
Yeah, well, it isn't that. He goes to, where the superheroes get together and all this, and he photographs that sort of stuff. His passion is wrestling.
Oh, wow, World Federation stuff.
Yeah, that sort of stuff, but he's into women's wrestling, and he has an appreciation for women athletes. He's also good with animals. He's good with his friends. He's a pretty good kid.
Oh, it sounds like the apple doesn't fall far, because he picked up that lesson from you, that he's not going to work his life away, that he's also going to enjoy it. So it sounds like he's pursuing his passion.
If I passed anything down to him, if it ain't fun, it shouldn't be getting done. That's pretty much the way it is. And the fact that he has passions is important. You imagine going through life where everything's boring?
No, I can't. No. Sorry. I'd pack it in. No, I can't do that.
Right. You would pack it in, exactly. If you didn't have something to think about, something to look forward to every day, memories to look back upon, it'd be horrible. And there are a lot of what I call Johnny Lunch Buckets. And they get up, they go to work, they're happy to have a job, even though the job they make doesn't necessarily, economy's good, everybody's working, but you work in jobs that, for the folks out there, not to generalize, a lot of folks, they work a 40-hour week and they're considered the new genre, the working poor. Can you imagine working 40 hours a week and not being able to support your family?
No.
That'd be even worse.
Terrible.
Than you can imagine. And then they make you feel, well, you got a job, be appreciative, that kind of thing. Reagan killed the unions, and we've never been the same since. So
your involvement, though, in your career has a nice segue. You just kind of glided into the next transition, though. I mean, you developed your career. For example, you did a cable television program, the glory days of New York baseball. You had affiliation with Tops, and that must have scored you contacts with minor leaguers.
You do what you can. I taught traffic school 3 days a week for a long time. So I stood in front of people, and I got to talk and orate about what's important about surviving driving, keeping it together. And basically, if I might mix this in, it's all about your head, what's going on. Are you rushed? Are you drugged up? Are you well-rested? It's driver demeanor. Are you early enough so that you don't have to cut someone off and get a ticket or kill yourself or others, that type of thing. And it's how you approach the road from your head. The rest of it is road. You make a left turn, you put your hand out the window, that kind of thing. But what goes on in your head, and I would touch upon everything, but I would really dwell in my classes on how to relate to other drivers, how to relate to police that pull up on you, and what to say and how to handle it. All those things are very important. So that gave me an idea that I had something interesting to say, along with my sports fanaticism and my political beliefs and my belief that what's killing us as a society is what I call the unholy trinity of organized religion, big business, and government. And if you could see them all working together to make sure that the middle class gets the low straw, draws the low straw. And let's face it, the middle class is the vast majority of us. There are very, very few. There are homeless out there. There are very, very poor people. But for the most part, people are employed, and we're trying to survive. And it's not easy.
We're the struggling middle class. That's what we are.
Exactly. And what used to be the middle, politically, is now very much the right. So we have to struggle to keep the left going. And
tell me about the podcast, Zig. How did you get into that? Because I know you made an initial foray, but you didn't commit to it, and then you came back in 2016. So how did you get involved?
I did. I was doing a podcast for, like I say, cathartic. To be cathartic, I started to really get a following of athletes, former athletes, coaches, minor league personnel, and it was becoming interesting. But there was a period of time where I just didn't think I had any more to say, and I had an interview with a fellow who later became an integral part of the network. His name is Ronnie Rabinovich. Mm-hmm. And Ronnie was 10 years old when his dad introduced him to a client of his. He was an attorney, and his name was Jackie Robinson. And his dad was a civil rights attorney. And Jackie and Ronnie, at 10 years old, became fast friends. And Ronnie has dedicated his life to carrying on the legacy of Jackie Robinson. Huh. And he gave me an interview that blew me away. And I realized that there was more to baseball than I believed, that I thought. If you look at it from a civil rights standpoint, there's more to baseball than I thought. Martin Luther King, when they told him that he is the godfather of civil rights, the grandfather of civil rights, he said, no, Jackie Robinson made that all possible. It may have happened 10, 20, 30 years later, but it wouldn't have happened then if it weren't for Jackie Robinson through baseball.
Right.
And remember how in the 40s and 50s and what have you, how baseball was the national pastime. Football hadn't come into its own until that very famous game between the Colts and the Giants, that playoff game, and what have you. Basketball was Bush, still is on a lot of levels, but baseball was something special. And the controversy, the lives that were changed when Branch Rickey had the guts to do what he did, and it became, in my mind, how are you ever going to run out of things to talk about? And I went from there to Peter Golenbach came aboard, who wrote Bums, and another book that was really the theme of it all. It's called The Forever Boys. About Peter Golenbach wrote about a group of folks in the early 80s who were newly retired, who formed a league in Florida, a seniors league in Florida.
Weren't they called the Pelicans?
They were indeed, and as a matter of fact,
was Randy Lurch one of those guys?
He was, and Randy Lurch is, whether you know this or not, he is the newest.
I saw that. You know whose show he was on first?
Well, yeah.
Well, I don't know. Maybe he was on someone else's show, but I got him on. I mean, yes, I got him on real fast after I connected with him. Larry Christensen introduced me to Randy, and he had one hell of a story to tell about his struggles. And I just, he wrote a book, and it's a brilliant book. So I'm glad he connected.
The book is called God's Miracle.
Yep.
And he named the podcast God's Miracle with Randy Lurch. And he's been chatting with me. He has 3 episodes in the can.
Great.
And he's
good man.
A very special guy. Let me just congratulate him. Last week he was inducted to the Sacramento Sports Hall of Fame.
I didn't know that. Wow. I got to text him. That's great.
Text him and congratulate him. You know who introduced him? And the next day he becomes manager of the Houston Astros was Dusty Baker.
Dusty Baker. No kidding. Wow.
Sacramento has a very, very rich sports history.
Oh, yeah, we got Larry Boa, a Philadelphia institution, who went to Sacramento City College, where he was picked up by Eddie Bachman in, I think, 1966 or 67, and the rest is history.
And carrying on the tradition of Sacramento City College baseball was Jerry Weinstein, and I had him on a couple of weeks ago as well.
Wow.
He sent about 200 guys to the bigs.
Wow.
Or to organize ball or something like that. A bunch of folks. Sacramento has a rich tradition of baseball, none more prominent than your friend Larry Boa. You're lucky to be in Philadelphia because there's one thing you can say: everybody is passionate about Philadelphia sports. There's not like 2, 3, and it's the Eagles, the Flyers, the Sixers, and before the Sixers, they were my Warriors. Who?
That's right.
I went to summer camp with Paul Arison would come up and Chuck Bednarik.
No kidding.
They would come up every 2 weeks each and give and sit in our bunks and give seminars and clinics and what have you. I got to know both those guys as a kid. Chuck Bednarik in 1960? I'm a kid. They just won the championship. He's telling me Van Brocklin stories.
Wow.
He was the last two-way player, if not
Concrete Chuck.
Concrete Chuck, and he had a brother who he'd bring up with him to, whose name escapes me now, and would be part of the clinics. Chuck could hike the ball under his legs, and it would go further than anybody in camp could throw the frickin' ball over there. I mean, unbelievable. I still see the ball shooting out of that snap. He'd snap his wrist down, and boy, it would go. Concrete Chuck, who, again, and Paul Arison, from Villanova, what can you say about having a personal relationship with the guy who would look you in the eye as a kid and communicate with you?
Cool.
It was great.
Those guys were class. I don't know if you remember Jerry Rulo. He was on that team. Jerry Rulo was my elementary school phys ed teacher. Wonderful man. Wonderful man. His son is a big-time basketball coach in the Philadelphia prep schools now. But very good man. Listen, one of the things about Comfortably Zoned that I've been so impressed with is, you don't let any grass grow under your feet. You started this network as really a sports network, but it has transitioned into a diversity of topics. I mean, you do politics, you do public service announcements, you do social justice issues. Talk about that transition. How did that happen? Because it's only been around since 2016, and that's pretty quick to change that the
platform. One of the
there.
things that made me change was an interview that you did with Ms. Garibaldi. And
right.
Why don't you talk about that? What an impression that made to folks who would say, well, everybody does steroids, this, that, and the other thing. And yes, everybody does it. You can say, let these guys into the Hall of Fame, this, that, and the other thing. But the real harm is kids being led to believe that it's okay because my role model does it. And the role model will say, well, they should get a parent to be their role model. Who am I? Well, that's a good argument. Who are you? You're being paid an exorbitant amount of money to represent a sport that is hitherto sacred on one level or another, And the whole idea of sports is passing it on to your children and the fans' children without them being harmed, without their team being taken away from them, and without getting some false stuff that steroids isn't just harmless. Would you elaborate on that interview that you did with Ms. Garibaldi?
Yeah, I met Denise actually through Donald Hooten, who was the founder of the Taylor Hooten Foundation, which is the only nonprofit educational organization that deals with the dangers and the symptoms of anabolic and performance-enhancing drugs and the dangers of those things. Don Hooten's son, Taylor Hooten, and Denise's son, Rob Garibaldi, were two phenomenal baseball players, clearly had a future in pro ball, and to accelerate their performance, they got hooked on PEDs. They really didn't know what they were doing. They abused them, and very sadly, very tragically, both young men took their lives. I wrote a book on that subject titled Suicide Squeeze, Taylor Hooten, Rob Garibaldi, and the dangers of PED abuse. And I did it for the same reason that you said. These people opened their lives to me, both the Garibaldi and Hooten families. I'm still in touch with them. I still do whatever I can for their respective organizations. But I had never written a book that emotionally powerful for me. My middle son, at the time I was writing the book, was a baseball player and had been pressured into abusing steroids by, ironically enough, some of the kids and a coach on a travel baseball team, and my son had the courage to stand up and say no. It probably cost them, his playing time, but this was just tragic. And PED use still continues to grow. Ironically, the fastest growing population are female non-athletes. They use a steroid called Winnostrol to be ripped, to improve their appearance, and it's sad. It is very sad. Now, I was part of that interview that you did with Denise, and one of the things, in fact, that I learned from you was your interviewing style, which is not only you're a very good listener, but you let the conversation breathe, and you were very sensitive to Denise, who still has great difficulty getting through an interview without becoming emotional in it, understandably so. But you were very kind, very considerate of her, and I thought it was one of the best interviews that I'd ever heard. Which is yet another reason I'm so grateful to you. But yeah, that's my relationship with the Garibaldis and the Hootens.
Yeah, well, it's amazing. The name Garibaldi. There was a pitcher with the Giants who was a relative. We've come to find out of the Garibaldis.
Yeah, Joe Garibaldi, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was John or Bob.
Could be John. I mean, the family is a big baseball family.
Yeah, he pitched for Santa Clara. He was a bonus baby with the Giants. He pitched on that 1962 team that was nationally champions. Mm-hmm. He didn't pitch an awful lot, but... And
the Hooten family has a pedigree, too, because Bert Hooton.
Bert Hooton, yeah.
Pitched for the Chicago Cubs and the LA Dodgers, and that is a cousin of Taylor Hooton. And Donald Jr. Was a crack pitcher for University of Texas. But after this stuff happened with his brother, he turned away from it, and he had pressure. He had pressure to juice too. He is now the president of the Taylor Hooton Foundation, and although he could make a lot more money doing what he was, doing because he was in business, he's foregone that to pretty much dedicate his life to this organization and its cause. I mean, these are very exceptional human beings, and I'm really privileged to have gotten to know them. But yeah, I mean, you're doing a lot of things on Comfortably Zoned. What does the future hold for the network, Zig?
Well, the future holds for the network only this, that we can guarantee. Every one of our offerings are archived on YouTube under the Comfortably Zoned channel, and 40 years from now, someone will be listening. And that's a pretty good future.
It's a great historical record. It really is.
Exactly.
We've been speaking with Ralph Zig Tyko, producer of Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Comfortably Zoned podcasts are available on iTunes and the Comfortably Zoned channel on YouTube, where over 2,500 offerings, as Ralph says, had been archived. For more information, listeners, please visit ComfortablyZonedRadio.com. Zig, thanks for joining me on the podcast and for all of your contributions to my career as a writer.
We belong to a mutual admiration
society. There you go.
My baby and me. I'm sure there are others that could sing better, but they wouldn't mean it as much as I do. Love you, my friend.
Thank you. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.